I was 72 years old when the phone rang that December evening. The snow had only just started falling in Cleveland, a light dusting that turned the street outside my window into a quiet silver path. My little house was still the same one Margaret and I had bought in 1974, a small two-bedroom place, paint-peeling pipes groaning in winter, but it was home. I was sitting at the kitchen table, same place I sat most nights, drinking weak coffee and flipping through the Gazette. My life was simple, predictable, until that call. I didn't recognize the number at first. These days, most calls are telemarketers or wrong numbers, so I almost let it go. But something, maybe the area code, maybe some old instinct, made me answer. I pressed the phone to my ear and heard a voice I hadn't heard in a quarter of a century. Dad. For a second, I thought I was dreaming. My chest tightened and I couldn't breathe. 25 years had passed since I'd last heard Melissa call me anything, let alone Dad. Time had aged her voice. It was softer now, practice polished by decades of living among lawyers and country club members. But beneath the polish, I recognized the tone. Sweet, careful, like honey, poured over a knife. It's me, Melissa. I've been thinking about you a lot. With the holidays coming, Jonathan and I were wondering, would you join us for Christmas Eve dinner? The kids would love to finally meet their grandfather. Her words spilled out smooth and deliberate. She didn't leave space for me to ask questions. She painted pictures of warm fires, a beautiful table, and grandchildren eager to know the man she had kept from them all these years. My throat tightened. I couldn't speak. I just sat there gripping the phone like it might vanish if I let go. After a pause, I managed to say I'd think about it. She gushed about how wonderful it would be, how we had wasted too much time apart, how forgiveness was the greatest gift of all. Then she hung up, leaving me alone with the hum of the refrigerator and the pounding of my heart. I stayed at the kitchen table long after the call ended, staring at the chipped surface, the stains of decades of meals. My hands shook as I lifted my coffee cup. My daughter had finally spoken to me after 25 years of silence. 25 years of unanswered letters, unopened birthday cards, and returned Christmas gifts. Suddenly, one call, one sugary invitation, and she wanted me back in her world. But I knew better. She hadn't called because she missed me. She hadn't called because of regret or guilt. She called because she'd seen the article in the Gazette 2 weeks earlier. My name had been printed in black and white under the headline, "Local Man Inherits $6.4 million from Brother." That single article changed everything. I went from invisible to useful in the blink of an eye. I leaned back in my chair and thought about the irony. For 25 years, Melissa hadn't cared if I was alive or dead. She had told her children, her friends, maybe even strangers, that I no longer existed. Yet now, with money attached to my name, I was suddenly worth calling. She thought I would show up grateful, desperate for scraps of affection, willing to forgive and forget. She thought wrong. Still, I'll admit, part of me wanted to believe her. Part of me longed to hear my grandchildren's voices, to see their faces. They had grown up thinking their grandfather was gone, stolen from them before they could form memories. It wasn't their fault. They were innocent in all of this. And that innocence gnawed at me. I didn't want to punish them for their mother's choices, but I couldn't ignore the bitter taste in my mouth, the feeling of betrayal that had hardened in me for decades. That night, I pulled out the banker's boxes from my closet. They were stacked, neatly labels written in my careful handwriting, 1999, 2000, 2001, and so on. Inside each box were envelopes, hundreds of them. Birthday cards returned unopened. Christmas gifts sent back with "Return to Sender" stamped coldly across the front. Letters I had written month after month, year after year, begging for a reply. All of them came back to me. I had saved every single one, organized by date. A machinist by trade, I had always been methodical. My hands knew the rhythm of precision, and I applied that same discipline to documenting my daughter's absence. As I flipped through the letters, I felt the weight of the years pressing down on me. Each envelope was a reminder of rejection, each stamp a symbol of her indifference. And yet I never threw them away. Somewhere deep down, I believed that one day she would come around, and I would be able to show her how much I had tried. That evidence, those silent witnesses, became my only connection to her. I thought about Margaret. She had begged me to stop writing years ago. Sam, she'd say she's made her choice. Don't torture yourself. But I couldn't let go. Even after Margaret died alone without her daughter by her side, I still kept writing for a while. I sent Melissa a letter telling her about her mother's passing, about the quiet funeral with just a handful of friends. That letter came back too, unopened, unwanted, unloved. Now, after all these years, Melissa wanted me at her table, not because of love, but because of money. The realization cut me deeper than any knife, but as I sat surrounded by those boxes, something hardened inside me. I wasn't the broken man she thought she could manipulate. I had lived too long, endured too much, and learned too well. This time, I would be the one writing the ending. I closed the boxes and slid them back into the closet. The snow outside had thickened into a soft white blanket. My house was quiet, but my mind was racing. I poured another cup of coffee and stared at the framed photo of Margaret on the counter. Her smile was gentle, her eyes kind. She deserved a daughter's love, and she never got it. Neither did I. But maybe there was still a way to set things right, not with Melissa, but with the truth. Christmas Eve would come soon enough. And when it did, Melissa would discover that her father wasn't so easy to bury after all. Looking back, the moment it all began feels like yesterday. The year was 1998. I was 45, then still strong in my shoulders, though my hands were already rough and scarred from decades on the factory floor. I had spent my whole adult life at Cleveland Steelworks, operating lathes, milling machines, and drills that could slice through iron like it was butter. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest. It put food on the table, paid the mortgage, and most importantly, it paid for my daughter's education. Melissa had been my pride and joy. The day she graduated law school, I thought I'd never felt prouder in my life. I remembered sitting in the audience, my hands aching from clapping so hard, watching her walk across that stage in her cap and gown. My eyes burned as I thought, "That's my girl." Every extra shift, every overtime hour, every ache in my back had been worth it. But pride has a cruel way of twisting. What I thought was the culmination of our bond turned out to be the beginning of the end. One autumn afternoon, she came to visit me at the factory. I remember it so clearly, the metallic smell of oil, the hum of machines, the clang of wrenches on steel. I had just finished wiping grease off my hands when I saw her standing at the entrance. She looked like she had stepped out of a magazine. Tailored navy blue suit, expensive leather heels, her blonde hair pulled into a perfect twist. She barely crossed the threshold, eyes darting around the workshop like the very air offended her. She didn't want to sit on the old wooden chair by my workbench. Instead, she stood tall, her arms folded. What she said that day was sharp, almost rehearsed. Words that sliced through me more painfully than any machine accident could. She told me the factory life was embarrassing, that her colleagues and new social circle wouldn't understand, that I should think about working somewhere more respectable, something where I'd wear a suit, maybe in sales, maybe at a dealership. She even mentioned a bank, as if a man like me could just walk in, wipe the grease from his fingernails, and be handed a desk. I remember the heat rising in my chest as I told her this was my life, my work, the very foundation that had lifted her up. My calloused hands had built her future. I expected her to understand, maybe even to soften. Instead, she smiled that cold, polished smile, as if I had confirmed her worst fears. Then came her ultimatum, change or stay out of her life. When she left that day, the sound of her heels clicking across the factory floor echoed in my head for weeks. It was the last real conversation we had as father and daughter. At first, I refused to believe she meant it. I kept writing. I sent her letters every month telling her about the garden, about her mother's health, about little things I thought might bridge the distance. I sent her birthday cards signed Love Dad. At Christmas, I wrapped gifts, even when money was tight, and mailed them with careful handwriting on the packages. Every single one came back. The first time I saw the words "Return to Sender" stamped in bold black ink, I felt a punch in my gut. But I told myself it was a mistake. The second, the third, the fourth time, it stopped feeling like a mistake. It became a message. I bought a box to keep them in. At first, it was just a practical way to avoid throwing them in the trash, but over time, the box became something else, a kind of evidence. I logged the dates, the addresses, the postmarks. Each envelope became part of a record proof that I had tried, proof that it wasn't me who walked away. The years rolled on and the box grew heavier. By 2002, I had filled a second box. By 2010, there were 4 of them. I stored them in the closet like relics of a relationship that had once been alive. Each one a tombstone for the love I'd once believed unbreakable. Margaret suffered the silence as much as I did. She was softer than me, more forgiving by nature. She would sit across from me at the kitchen table, watching me address another envelope, and she'd shake her head. "Sam," she'd whisper, "she doesn't want to hear from us. You're only hurting yourself." But she knew I couldn't stop. A father doesn't stop loving his child just because she slams the door. When Margaret got sick, pancreatic cancer, the kind that steals a person faster than you can believe, I thought maybe that would change things. I wrote, Melissa begged her to call to come see her mother one last time. That letter came back, like all the others, unopened. Margaret passed in the summer of 2011. The funeral was small, just me, a few of my old coworkers, and 2 neighbors. I remember standing by the grave, staring at the empty space where my daughter should have been. That was the moment something inside me snapped. I realized Melissa would never come back. Still, I couldn't throw the letters away. After Margaret died, I sent one last envelope on Melissa's 40th birthday. In it, I wrote about her mother, about the scrapbook Margaret had kept of every article and photo from Melissa's law career. I told her how proud her mother had been. That envelope came back too, but this time something was different. The flap looked like it had been tugged at the corner, smudged with pencil marks, as if someone had considered opening it, but changed their mind. I framed that letter and set it on the kitchen table beside Margaret's photo. It became a symbol of hope, however faint, that one day Melissa might see the truth. But as the years ticked by, the hope faded into habit. My life grew smaller. Work meals, coffee at the kitchen table, evenings in silence. I became invisible in my own daughter's world. And yet, I never felt ashamed of who I was. My clothes were simple, my house modest, but I knew the value of the sweat that had paid for her education, the hours that had built her foundation. I carried that pride quietly, even as the world around me seemed to forget I existed. When the inheritance came decades later, it wasn't just money. It was a mirror. It showed me who had stood by me, who had turned away, and who had built their lives on lies. And when Melissa's voice came through the phone after 25 years of silence, I understood something clearly. For the first time, she hadn't abandoned me because I was small. She abandoned me because she was afraid her world would see my strength as weakness. That realization didn't bring pain anymore. It brought clarity. Christmas was coming, and with it, a chance to finally put the past to rest. After Margaret passed in 2011, the house felt like a museum. Every corner of it held a piece of her favorite blue teacup on the shelf, the blanket she had knitted draped over the arm of the couch, the faint scent of lavender still lingering in the bedroom. For a while, I couldn't bring myself to touch anything. It felt like erasing her. So the house remained frozen, a quiet monument to the life we had shared, and the silence grew heavier with each passing day. In the absence of her voice, the boxes of letters became my companions. 4 banker's boxes lined neatly in the closet, each one labeled in my handwriting sharp black marker across beige cardboard. 1999, 2002, 2003, 2006, 2007, 2010, 2011, 2014. By the time Margaret was gone, the 5th box had already begun to fill. It might sound foolish saving envelopes that only carried rejection, but to me, they were proof that I hadn't given up. Each letter I wrote was a prayer, a plea, or sometimes just a reminder to Melissa that I still existed. I never sent them in anger. Even in the loneliest moments, I wrote with patience and hope. I told her about the seasons changing, about my mother's old rosebush blooming late one year, about the dog that followed me home from the shop and slept by my feet for a week. Small, ordinary things. The kind of things family shares when the rest of the world doesn't care. And when they came back, unopened, stamped with that cold phrase, "Return to sender," I placed them in the boxes organized by date sealed like artifacts. A machinist learns early that records matter. Measurements, blueprints, logbooks, details are the difference between a working machine and a broken one, so I kept my record of fatherhood, even if it was one-sided. Some evenings, after the factory closed and the hum of the machines faded from my ears, I would sit at the kitchen table and spread the envelopes across the surface. I would line them up in neat rows, watching the years stretch out in paper and ink. 2 decades of effort reduced to silent stacks of unopened words. At first, it filled me with sorrow, but eventually it gave me a strange kind of strength. Each letter was evidence not of failure, but of persistence. A record that I had not walked away. Friends asked sometimes gently why I didn't just let it go. My neighbor George would drop by with a 6-pack and shake his head when he saw me bent over another letter. "Sam, you're torturing yourself," he'd say. But what he didn't understand was that writing those letters wasn't just about Melissa. It was about holding on to the part of myself that refused to become bitter. I needed to believe that love was stronger than rejection, even if no one else believed it. The factory kept me alive through those years. The rhythm of it was comforting. The clang of steel, the steady whir of machines, it was music to me. I was never a man for boardrooms or polished shoes. My world was sweat grit and precision. Each shift reminded me that my work had value, even if my daughter couldn't see it. I helped build things that lasted gears, shafts, tools that kept other machines alive. That was my quiet contribution to the world, unseen but essential. But nights were harder. Nights were when the silence pressed down like a weight on my chest. Margaret's absence was loudest then. I would sit in my recliner flipping through the television channels, not really watching, just filling the room with noise. Sometimes I'd fall asleep with the lamp still on the framed letter from Melissa's 40th birthday propped on the table beside me. The one with the faint pencil mark on the flap, as though her conscience had wrestled with the choice to open it. That letter gave me more comfort than all the others because it suggested that somewhere inside her there was still hesitation, still doubt, still the faintest possibility of care. Birthdays came and went without a call. Christmases were quiet. I stopped expecting the phone to ring. My life became smaller, simpler. Work, coffee, the newspaper, and the maintenance of those boxes. I took to writing notes to myself on yellow legal pads, memories of Melissa as a child, things I didn't want to forget in case I ever had the chance to tell her. I wrote about the time she'd begged for a red bicycle, how I'd worked double shifts to afford it, and how her face lit up brighter than the sun when she saw it under the tree. I wrote about the night she won the spelling bee in middle school, standing tall on the stage, while Margaret wept with joy in the crowd. I filled page after page with those moments, little reminders of a love that had once been real. There were darker notes too. The day she walked into the factory in that navy blue suit, the way her eyes skimmed across my workbench with disgust, the coldness in her voice when she said respectable. I wrote those down not to nurse the wound, but to remember the truth. Memory has a way of softening with time, and I didn't want to forget the clarity of that moment. I wanted to remember that she had chosen distance, not me. When Uncle Robert passed and left me his modest inheritance years earlier, I had thought briefly about sending Melissa part of it as a way to reach out. But I never did. Something in me knew it wouldn't matter. She had built a life where I had no place. It wasn't until my brother Henry's estate came to me that the scale changed. $6.4 million. More money than I had ever dreamed of, more than I would ever need. And suddenly Melissa remembered I existed. It wasn't love that had driven her back to my door. It was curiosity, greed, perhaps fear of being left out of what she now saw as hers. That knowledge didn't break me. By then, I was beyond breaking. Instead, it sharpened me. All those years of rejection, all those unopened letters had prepared me for this moment. I knew what I carried, the boxes, the memories, the records, was more powerful than any story she had told about me. Margaret used to tell me that truth has a way of coming out, no matter how deeply it's buried. I hadn't believed it then, but now, with those boxes stacked neatly in my closet and $6 million in the bank, I felt the truth stirring. It was only a matter of time before it demanded to be spoken. And when Christmas Eve came, Melissa would learn that the father she had declared dead was still very much alive and ready to speak for himself. The call came on a gray October morning, the kind of morning when the air feels damp before the rain even begins. I was sipping coffee at my kitchen table, the Gazette folded beside me, when the phone rang. I almost didn't answer. I rarely did anymore, but something in the stillness made me pick it up. The voice on the other end was formal, polite, professional. An attorney from Boston introducing himself as David Lang, executor of my brother Henry's estate. My stomach sank at the word estate. Though Henry and I hadn't lived in the same state for decades, we had kept in touch. He had always been the dreamer of the family. While I stayed in Cleveland, grinding through shifts at the factory, Henry had gone east chasing business ventures, investing in properties, and living a life that seemed far removed from my own. The attorney's tone softened as he delivered the news Henry had passed away, suddenly a heart attack in his sleep. For a moment, I couldn't process it. I sat there staring at the wall, the phone pressed to my ear, hearing only the buzz of silence behind his words. My last conversation with Henry had been just weeks before. He had spoken of the autumn leaves in Boston, of his plans to renovate an old apartment building he'd purchased years ago. He'd sounded alive, energetic, and now he was gone. Then came the second blow, just as heavy as the first. Henry had left everything to me, his properties, his investments, his savings. The total, the attorney explained, was valued at $6.4 million. I nearly dropped the phone. The number didn't sound real. I had never had more than a modest savings account, just enough to keep me comfortable in retirement. $6.4 million. My brother, who had always seemed to scrape by on modest means, had somehow built a fortune in bricks, mortar, and patience. I hung up the phone in a daze. For hours, I wandered the house, pausing by Margaret's photo, whispering the news as though she could still hear me. I thought about the years we had pinched pennies to send Melissa through law school, about the overtime shifts, the secondhand clothes, the vacations we never took. $6 million could have changed everything back then, but Henry hadn't spoken of his wealth, and we hadn't asked. He had simply lived his life, and in the end, he left it all to me. The attorney's paperwork arrived within days. I studied it carefully, not because I distrusted him, but because the numbers seemed too large to believe. Apartment complexes and Back Bay mutual funds, a portfolio of stocks I barely understood. I called George, my neighbor and friend, to sit with me as I went through the details. He whistled low, shaking his head. "Sam, you're rich," he said, his voice caught between awe and disbelief. But the truth was, I didn't feel rich. I felt burdened. What does a 72-year-old machinist do with $6 million? I had no appetite for mansions, no craving for luxury cars. My old truck was good enough. My small house suited me fine. Wealth at my age didn't mean freedom, it meant responsibility. 2 days after the article ran in the Gazette announcing the inheritance, the first cracks of change appeared. George knocked on my door, waving the newspaper. "You've seen this, Sam. You're in the business section." There it was, black print on white paper. Local retiree inherits $6.4 million from brother. My name, my address, my story, all public. By the time I finished reading the article twice, the phone rang again. This time, it wasn't an attorney. It was Melissa. Her voice was warm, syrupy, layered with a sweetness that felt practiced. She said she was sorry for my loss, though she had never once mentioned Henry before. She spoke of wasted years of family bonds, of forgiveness. She painted a picture of togetherness, of grandchildren eager to meet their grandfather. I listened in silence, my heart pounding my mind, replaying every unopened letter, every returned package. She hadn't cared when her mother died. She hadn't cared when I aged alone. But now, when $6.4 million had made me a headline, suddenly she remembered how to dial my number. I hung up after telling her I'd think about it. And then I sat in the kitchen, staring at the boxes stacked neatly in the closet. For 25 years, I had been invisible. Now money had made me visible again. I didn't sleep much that week. I kept replaying her words in my head, searching for sincerity. There was none. Each sentence had been wrapped in careful phrasing, like lines from a script she'd rehearsed in front of a mirror. Her apology had been smooth, too smooth, the kind of apology meant to erase history rather than acknowledge it. The boxes of letters became heavier in my mind. They weren't just paper anymore, they were ammunition, evidence of who I was and who she had chosen to pretend I wasn't. I began to realize that Henry's gift was more than financial. He had given me the means, the stage, and the clarity to confront the past. When George came by later that week, I shared my suspicions. He frowned, his weathered face darkening. "Sam, she's smelled the money. That's all this is. Don't let her fool you." I nodded, though inside part of me still wrestled with the desire to believe. A father doesn't stop hoping even when he knows better. But the hope was different now. It wasn't hope for reconciliation. It was hope for truth. I wanted the lies stripped bare. I wanted her polished world to see what she had done not just to me, but to the idea of family itself. I lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the winter wind howl through the cracks in the siding. For years, I had wondered if my story would end quietly, if I would leave this world remembered by no one but the boxes in my closet. But now, fate had handed me a different ending. I didn't know exactly what it would look like yet, but I knew one thing: I would not let Melissa write the final chapter. Christmas Eve was approaching. An invitation had been extended, and I knew deep down that it was more than just a dinner. It was a performance. For her friends, for her reputation, for the carefully constructed story she had built. She wanted me to play the role of forgiven father, grateful and humbled. But I had a different role in mind. The more I thought about Melissa's sudden warmth, the more uneasy I became. Her words replayed in my mind like a scratched record forgiveness family second chances. They sounded noble, but to me, they rang hollow. What gnawed at me most wasn't just her return, but the timing. 25 years of silence broken only days after the Gazette printed my name beside a fortune. Coincidence? I'd worked too long with machines to believe in coincidences. A machinist trusts what he sees. I had spent my life examining gears and shafts, knowing that if one part didn't fit, the entire machine would fail. And Melissa's story didn't fit. The timing was too perfect, her voice too careful. Something was hidden under the hood, and I intended to find it. That's when I thought of Eddie Morales. Eddie had been a classmate back in high school, a wiry kid with quick eyes who later became a Cleveland cop. He'd spent 20 years in the force before starting his own private investigation business in a cramped office above a diner on Lorraine Avenue. Over the years, we'd run into each other at the grocery store, exchanging nods and brief conversations. I knew he was discreet, the kind of man who could uncover truths without drawing too much attention. I called him one brisk morning and explained enough of my situation to pique his interest. He invited me to his office, and I drove there in my old pickup, the heater struggling against the December cold. The diner downstairs smelled of bacon and coffee, a smell that carried up the stairs to Eddie's cluttered office. Piles of files and photographs covered his desk, the walls lined with corkboards and faded case notes. He looked older, grayer, but the sharpness in his eyes hadn't dulled. I sat down and told him everything. About the phone call after 25 years, about the sudden inheritance, about my suspicions that Melissa's motives were less about reconciliation and more about money. Eddie listened quietly, leaning back in his chair, his hands folded over his chest. When I finished, he rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Sam, you don't need me to tell you this smells bad. If you want, I can dig around, see what she's been saying about you all these years." I nodded. I need to know, not guesses, facts. Eddie agreed to take the case. His rate wasn't cheap, but money wasn't the issue anymore. For me, the cost wasn't financial, it was emotional. I braced myself for answers I might not want to hear. The next 2 weeks were some of the longest of my life. Eddie worked quietly, but he gave me small updates now and then. He'd attended events at Melissa's country club, spoken to people who knew her socially, and combed through archives of local newspapers. Each update left my stomach in knots. Finally, one cold morning in mid-December, Eddie called. "Sam, I've got something. You better come by." When I arrived, his office felt heavier than usual. He had a manila folder on his desk, thick with papers. His face was serious. "Before I show you this," he said, "I want you to prepare yourself. It's not good." I opened the folder and froze. The first page was a printout of a fake obituary, dated March 1999. My name, my age, my occupation, cause of death, single-car accident on Route 8. The obituary claimed I had died at 50, survived by my loving daughter Melissa and her devoted husband Jonathan. At the bottom, it requested donations in my memory to a local youth charity. My hands trembled as I traced the words with my finger. I was reading my own death notice printed in the Cleveland Herald for the entire city to see. The letters blurred as my eyes filled. Eddie's voice cut through my fog. She wrote it herself, not professionally done. I traced the submission. It came from her office fax line. I turned the page and saw more. Copies of newsletters from the Meadowbrook Country Club. Each year, Melissa had stood up at memorial luncheons speaking about the tragedy of losing her father young. She had told stories of my supposed virtues, hard-working, humble, a man who sacrificed everything for her future. Stories that might have warmed me if they weren't delivered in the past tense, as if I had been buried beneath the ground instead of sitting in my little house on West 54th Street, alive and waiting for her to acknowledge me. Then came the photographs. Melissa at galas, her arm looped through Jonathan's, her children standing nearby. In captions beneath the glossy images, the words "in memory of her father" appeared again and again. She had built part of her identity around being the daughter who had triumphed over grief. Eddie handed me another document, his voice lower now. "She's been telling people for years that you died. At first, just to explain why you weren't around, but it grew. She gave speeches, wrote articles, used your death as part of her story." I flipped through the stack. There were clippings from Bar Association journals where she had written about resilience after tragedy. There were charity acknowledgments in my name, small donations she had made publicly, so others would see her devotion. There was even a scholarship fund at a community college bearing my name as a memorial. Each page was like a hammer blow. Not only had she erased me from her life, she had rewritten me into a story that suited her ambitions. She hadn't just abandoned me. She had buried me alive in the eyes of everyone she knew. The worst part came when Eddie slid across a school essay found in an old yearbook archive, written by her daughter, my granddaughter Anna, in 10th grade. The essay was titled "The Grandfather I Never Knew." She had written with such sincerity about a man she believed had died before she was born. She described how her mother told her he had been a kind, hard-working man tragically lost in an accident. She ended with, "I wish I could have known him." I sat there staring at that line until my eyes blurred again. My granddaughter had mourned me without ever meeting me, while I was still alive, waiting with open arms. When I finally spoke, my voice was hoarse. She told the world I was dead. Eddie nodded solemnly. "For 20 years, Sam. Everyone who knows her believes it. At the country club, at her firm, even her children. To them, you've been gone since '99. I closed the folder and sat in silence. Rage, grief, humiliation, they churned inside me, but underneath them all was clarity. For 25 years, I had wondered why she didn't answer. I had blamed myself, searched for faults, replayed that conversation in the factory over and over. Now I knew the truth. It wasn't about embarrassment. It wasn't about shame. It was about convenience. It was easier to declare me dead than admit she had chosen to cut me out. I stood slowly, the folder heavy in my hands. "Thank you, Eddie," I said. My voice shook, but my spine felt straighter than it had in years. As I stepped into the cold winter air outside his office, I realized something had changed inside me. I wasn't just a father grieving rejection anymore. I was a man with evidence, a man with truth. And Christmas Eve, I decided, would not be the quiet reunion Melissa imagined. It would be the day the dead man came back to life. I carried the manila folder home like it was a weapon. Inside those pages was my death, printed and rehearsed for the world to see. And I knew then that Melissa had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. At the kitchen table, I spread everything out: obituaries, clippings, photographs, charity letters, even the essay written by my granddaughter. The table wasn't large, but it was sturdy oak, the same one Margaret and I had shared for decades. That night, its surface disappeared beneath 20 years of lies. I sat in silence, studying each piece. I moved them around the way I used to arrange machine parts before reassembling an engine. Every part had its place. The obituary was the cornerstone, the first bold step in rewriting me. The country club speeches added polish, wrapping the lie in silk and crystal glass. The donations gave it credibility because who would doubt grief that came with money attached? And the scholarship fund sealed it, transforming her from a daughter who abandoned her father into a daughter who honored him. As I shuffled the pages, I thought about Margaret. I imagined her watching over my shoulder, her brow furrowed, her lips pressed tight with that quiet strength she carried. She had told me again and again to stop torturing myself with unanswered letters. But she had also believed in truth. If she could see this, if she could see how her daughter had paraded my supposed death for applause, I think even she would say, "Enough." I opened the closet and brought out the banker's boxes. For years, they had been my burden. Now they were my counterweight. I stacked them beside the folder, forming two towers of evidence. One tower told the story of a father's persistence. The other told the story of a daughter's deceit. Together, they created a balance that no one could deny. I ran my fingers along the neat labels 1999, 2003, 2007, each one a chapter of rejection. I remembered writing those addresses in careful script, licking the envelopes, sealing them with hope. And I remembered the sting when they came back unopened. But now, they weren't just reminders of failure. They were proof that I had tried year after year, never wavering. The weight of it all pressed down on me. Not just the paper, but the years, the silence, the deliberate cruelty. I sat back exhausted, though I hadn't moved much. I poured a cup of coffee and stared at the photo of Margaret across the room. Her eyes seemed to ask me the question I already knew the answer to. What will you do with this Sam? I couldn't pretend anymore. I couldn't let Melissa's version of my life stand unchallenged. She had erased me to build herself, used my death as the foundation of her reputation. She had stolen not just my dignity, but my grandchildren's right to know me. That could not go unanswered. But I also knew I couldn't just storm into her house waving papers and shouting accusations. That would only confirm whatever stories she had told about me unstable, embarrassing a man to be pitied or avoided. No, if I was going to do this, it had to be deliberate, measured, undeniable. I spent the next days organizing. I bought a leather briefcase at a secondhand store, polished brass corners, and a sturdy handle. It felt almost ceremonial, carrying my life in something that belonged in a courtroom. Inside, I arranged the documents chronologically, each section divided with tabs I labeled myself. Obituary, newsletters, donations, scholarship, speeches, school essay, letters. I rehearsed in my mind how it might unfold. Christmas Eve dinner, the polished table, the guests Melissa had invited to witness her grand act of reconciliation. She thought she would be showing off her forgiveness, parading her father as a prop in her story of grace. But I would bring the truth into that room piece by piece until her lies crumbled around her. At night, I dreamed of it. Sometimes the dream ended with me standing tall, documents spread like Holy Scripture, guests gasping in shock. Other times, the dream turned darker, Melissa screaming, calling me a liar, twisting the story yet again until I was painted as the villain. Those dreams left me shaken awake at 3 a.m, staring at the ceiling while the furnace groaned. George came by one evening, finding me hunched over the kitchen table with papers spread everywhere. He studied the piles, then looked at me. "Sam, you're building a case like a lawyer." I smiled faintly. "No, George, I'm building a truth, one that can't be denied." He nodded, though I saw the worry in his eyes. He knew as well as I did that this wouldn't end quietly, but he also knew I couldn't step back now. As the days ticked toward Christmas, I grew more certain. I wasn't doing this for revenge, not exactly. I was doing it for Margaret, who deserved honesty, for Anna and Luke, who deserved to know the grandfather they had been denied, for myself too, for the years I had lived in shadows erased by my own blood. One snowy morning, I walked past the country club where Melissa had delivered so many of her speeches. From the road, I could see the manicured lawns, the tall windows glowing warm against the winter air. Somewhere inside those walls was a plaque with my name etched on it, a plaque honoring a man who had never died. I stood there in the cold, watching the cars pull into the drive, thinking about all the people who had raised glasses in my memory. And I thought, they will see me alive. They will know the truth. Back home, I sat once more at the table, the briefcase, opened the papers in order. For years, I had been the silent one, the man whose letters went unanswered. But silence had its own kind of power. It let me wait. It let me prepare it. Let me build a mountain of evidence while Melissa spun her tales. Now that silence was over, I closed the briefcase, fastened the brass clasps, and placed it beside the chair where Margaret used to sit. My heart pounded, but it wasn't fear. It was resolve, the kind of resolve that comes only after decades of waiting. Christmas Eve was approaching, and this time I wasn't coming as the forgotten father. I was coming as the man who had been declared dead, returning to claim his place among the living. The invitation came exactly 1 week before Christmas. The phone rang on a Thursday evening, just as the last light of day slipped behind the rooftops, and the snow outside thickened into a white curtain. I had been sitting in my recliner, staring at the flicker of the television without really watching, when the sound jolted me upright. I glanced at the screen, an unfamiliar number, but the area code was familiar. I didn't need to wonder long who it might be. When I answered, Melissa's voice flowed into my ear, carefully measured, soft, and sweet, as though she'd practiced each syllable. "Dad, I've been thinking about our talk," she said. "The holidays are here, and I don't want us to waste any more time. We're having Christmas Eve dinner at our home in Shaker Heights. Jonathan, the kids, some close friends. It would mean so much if you joined us." Her tone was casual, but I could hear the urgency beneath it, a nervous current in her polished delivery. She didn't say it outright, but I knew what she wanted: a performance. To unveil her father, the man she had forgiven, before the same circle of people who had spent years believing I was gone. I told her I'd come. My voice was steady, my words few. I didn't offer enthusiasm or gratitude, just confirmation. She filled the silence with her own nervous chatter, saying how wonderful it would be, how much Anna and Luke wanted to meet me, how forgiveness was the greatest gift of the season. I let her talk my mind, already elsewhere, picturing the briefcase waiting at my kitchen table. When I hung up, I sat for a long while in the quiet, the snow falling heavy outside. I thought about what this dinner would mean. For Melissa, it was supposed to be a stage, a chance to polish her image as the forgiving daughter. But for me, it would be something else, entirely a resurrection. That night, I called George. He had been my closest friend since Margaret's passing, the kind of man who showed up without asking when the gutters needed cleaning or when the old truck needed a jump. He answered on the second ring, his voice rough with the gravel of years. "She invited me to Christmas," I said. There was a pause, then a low whistle. "Sam, that smells like a trap." "It is," I admitted, "but not the way she thinks." I asked him to come with me, not just as company, but as a witness. Someone who knew me, who could see what unfolded with clear eyes. George didn't hesitate. "You don't go into a lion's den alone," he said. In the days that followed, I prepared in silence. Each evening, I opened the briefcase and studied the documents again, rehearsing in my mind how it might unfold. The obituary, the speeches, the donations, the school essay, they would all be there ready to speak louder than any accusation I could make. My role was simple: to place the truth in the middle of her carefully set table and let it speak for itself. I pressed my shirts, polished the shoes Margaret had bought me years ago, and pulled my sport coat from the back of the closet. It still carried the faint scent of cedar from the old wardrobe. I wanted to look presentable, not flashy, not desperate to impress, just respectable in my own skin. A man who had worked hard all his life and wasn't ashamed of it. At night, sleep came fitfully. I would wake at 3 or 4, the furnace clicking on the house, creaking in the cold. My thoughts circled endlessly. What if she denied everything? What if she twisted the story again, made me the villain in front of her friends? What if Anna and Luke looked at me with suspicion rather than recognition? Those thoughts weighed heavy. But then I would remember the essay, the words, "The grandfather I never knew," and a surge of resolve would steady me. They deserved the truth, even if it shattered the illusions their mother had built. The closer Christmas Eve came, the more I felt the years pressing down on me. 25 years of silence. 25 years of rejection rewritten as tragedy. I wasn't just preparing for a dinner, I was preparing for Judgment Day. On the morning of December 24th, I woke before dawn. The world outside was hushed, blanketed in snow that glowed pale under the streetlights. I brewed coffee, black and bitter, and sat at the kitchen table with the briefcase in front of me. Margaret's photo watched from its frame, her gentle smile, a reminder of what was at stake. I whispered to her, as I often did, "Tonight, Maggie, tonight we set it straight." George arrived at noon, dressed in his cleanest flannel shirt and dark jeans. He looked at me then at the briefcase and gave a firm nod. Neither of us spoke much. Words felt unnecessary now. When the time came, we climbed into my old truck, the engine groaning before catching with a steady rumble. The roads were slick, but familiar. I had driven them many times, though rarely toward Shaker Heights. That neighborhood had always belonged to people like Melissa, not people like me. As we turned onto her street, I felt the weight of the moment settle on my shoulders. The houses were grand, each one lit with glowing wreaths and twinkling lights, their driveways packed with sleek cars. We pulled into the circular drive of her Tudor-style home, our pickup truck looking out of place among the polished sedans and imported SUVs. I killed the engine and sat in silence for a moment, my hand resting on the handle of the briefcase. My heart thudded heavy in my chest, but it wasn't fear anymore. It was purpose. George placed a hand on my shoulder. "You ready?" I nodded, opening the door. The cold air hit my face sharp and clean. Snow crunched beneath our boots as we walked toward the front door, the warm glow of lights spilling through frosted windows. Somewhere inside, voices and laughter floated faintly, the hum of a holiday gathering. I took a deep breath, straightened my coat, and tightened my grip on the briefcase. After 25 years of silence, after being declared dead and buried in words and lies, I was about to step into her world again. But this time, I wasn't coming as the forgotten father. I was coming as the truth she had tried so hard to bury. The door opened before I could knock twice. Melissa stood framed in the golden glow of her foyer, a cream-colored dress hugging her figure pearls glistening at her throat. For a split second, I almost didn't recognize her. Time had refined her, softened the sharp edges of youth into a kind of practiced elegance. She smiled wide, the kind of smile you reserve for photographs, not reunions. "Dad." She breathed, her arms outstretched as if 25 years could vanish in a single embrace. Her perfume hit me as she leaned in, floral and expensive. I stood stiff, letting the briefest of embraces pass before stepping back. Behind her, I could see the living room filled with warm, light-polished wood floors and voices rising from within. Come in, she said, her tone rehearsed coaxing. Everyone is so excited to meet you. George and I stepped inside. Our boots clunked against the gleaming tile, the sound out of place in a home where shoes were more likely to tread softly across plush rugs. The air smelled of roasted meat, cinnamon, and pine. A towering Christmas tree glittered in the corner, its ornaments carefully color-matched, not a trace of handmade imperfection. Melissa led us toward the living room, her voice carrying, "Everyone, he's here. My father." The room fell into a hush. 12 faces turned toward me. Men in pressed suits, women in elegant dresses, crystal glasses in their hands. Their eyes widened, confusion flickering as they studied me. I saw the questions forming already. Hadn't they been told he was dead? Melissa filled the silence, quickly sweeping me into introductions. She named them one by one: the Hendersons, the Davises, the president of the country club, a doctor, and his wife. Jonathan appeared last tall, distinguished, his suit tailored perfectly, his handshake firm and cool. He smiled politely, though his eyes darted briefly to the briefcase in my hand before flicking away. And then they came Anna and Luke, my grandchildren. Young adults, now their features a blend of Melissa's sharpness and Jonathan's refinement. Anna's hair fell in loose curls over her shoulders. Luke stood taller than I'd imagined, his gaze uncertain. They hesitated a moment before offering soft greetings, voices polite but distant, as if they weren't sure what role I was supposed to play. I answered them gently, my heart squeezing tight. These were the children who had written essays about a grandfather they thought had died. Children who had grown up with a void shaped like me, filled with stories spun by their mother. Now, here we stood, separated by decades of silence and lies, awkwardly shaking hands as if we were strangers. Melissa's voice cut through the moment. "Let's move to the dining room," she said, her tone light, cheerful. "Dinner is ready." The dining room looked like something out of a glossy magazine spread. A table stretched, long and gleaming, set with fine china, rimmed in gold crystal glasses that sparkled under the chandelier's glow, silver cutlery polished to a mirror shine. A centerpiece of winter flowers and pine cones ran the length of it, candles flickering between blooms. At each place, a name card had been carefully written in calligraphy. My card sat at the head of the table, guest of honor. I placed the briefcase by my chair before sitting down. The weight of it grounded me, a reminder of why I was there. George sat beside me, his presence a steady anchor. The meal began in polite conversation. Platters of roasted turkey, glazed ham, and bowls of vegetables were passed with practiced hands. Guests spoke of business, of winter travel plans, of the latest club events. Their words flowed easily, though glances flickered my way, often curiosity burning behind their polite expressions. Melissa filled the gaps, steering the conversation whenever it veered too close to history. She spoke of family, of forgiveness, of how wonderful it was to have everyone together. Her tone was smooth, her gestures elegant. She was performing, and she knew it. I watched her carefully. The way she smiled at her guests, the way she emphasized certain words, the way she glanced at me with a rehearsed warmth that never quite reached her eyes. She wasn't just hosting dinner, she was staging a play, casting herself as the gracious daughter, welcoming back the father she had forgiven. The irony nearly choked me. As plates were cleared and wine refilled, Jonathan rose briefly to thank everyone for coming. His words were polished, his voice commanding. Then Melissa stood, lifting her glass. To family, she said, her voice clear. To second chances. To the love that endures even when time keeps us apart. Around the table, glasses lifted. To family, they echoed. I raised mine as well, though my eyes never left hers. For 25 years, she had raised glasses in my memory. Tonight, she raised one in my presence, as if both could exist without contradiction. Dinner carried on, but beneath the laughter and polite chatter, a tension grew in me. I felt the moment approaching the point where silence would no longer serve. My fingers brushed the briefcase under the table, the cool leather against my skin. George caught my eye, gave a slight nod. He knew. I let Melissa have her moment, let her bask in the illusion of control. She thought she had staged the perfect act. Father returned, guests impressed, reputation polished. But as the final course was cleared and the candles flickered low, I knew it was time. I placed my glass down gently, the sound sharp in the hush. The table quieted. All eyes turned toward me. "Thank you," I said, slowly, my voice steady. This has been something I've waited a long time for, to sit here among you all people who have been so important to my daughter's life, to finally see the faces of my grandchildren, to be welcomed back. Melissa beamed her hand, resting lightly on Jonathan's arm, but I continued my hand, reaching down, fingers closing around the handle of the briefcase. There's something I've carried with me tonight that I think you all deserve to see. The room stilled, the air thickened, forks paused mid-air. I set the briefcase on the table, the brass clasps catching the light. Melissa's smile faltered. The performance was about to end. The clasps on the briefcase snapped open with a metallic click that echoed louder than it should have in that perfect dining room. For a moment, no one moved. Candles flickered, glasses caught the light, and 12 pairs of eyes shifted from me to Melissa, then back again. I pulled the first document from the folder and slid it across the table toward the nearest guest, a crisp copy of the obituary Melissa had written in 1999. My name, my death date, my fabricated accident. The woman who picked it up, Mrs. Henderson, if I remembered correctly, read silently, her face paling. She passed it to the man beside her, who frowned and leaned closer to the page. The paper made its slow journey around the table, the weight of disbelief settling heavier with each hand it touched. This, I said, my voice steady, is how my daughter introduced me to the world after she cut me out of her life. According to this, I died 25 years ago in a car crash. I was buried in ink while I was still here, sending letters that never reached her table. A murmur rippled around the guests. Jonathan stiffened in his chair, his hand tightening around his wine glass. Melissa sat frozen, her smile collapsed into something brittle, her eyes darting desperately. I pulled out the next set country club newsletters printed in neat columns with photographs of Melissa smiling in pearls and evening gowns. Each year, she'd stood before these very people speaking of her late father. Her words praised my work ethic, my supposed sacrifice, my tragic absence. Here, I said, sliding copies along the polished table, is the story she told you. Year after year, she wove her grief into speeches, spoke of honoring a father who was according to her gone. She painted me as both saint and shadow, a memory to polish her reputation. I placed more pages on the table, letters from charities acknowledging donations made in my memory. $500 here, $1,000 there, each one public enough to remind others of her devotion, small enough to be convenient. She used my name as currency, I continued. Every check was signed with the ink of a lie. Gasps rose from the guests. I caught one man shaking his head, whispering to his wife. Another guest frowned down at the newsletter as if trying to reconcile the living man at the head of the table with the ghost he'd been told about for decades. But I wasn't finished. I reached deeper into the briefcase and pulled out the essay. My granddaughter Anna's words written in a teenager's careful hand. The grandfather I never knew. I read the title aloud, my voice catching, then placed the paper where everyone could see. This, I said quietly, is the part that broke me. My granddaughter writing about a man she believed had died before she was born. She mourned me on paper while I was alive, waiting for the chance to know her. Silence settled heavy over the table. The only sound was the faint crackle of the fireplace. Melissa finally found her voice brittle and sharp. "Dad, please, this isn't the time." I raised a hand, cutting her off without raising my tone. "The time has come and gone, Melissa. For 25 years, I stayed quiet. I wrote letters. I sent gifts. I begged for the chance to be part of your life. Every envelope came back unopened, every call unanswered. And all the while, you told the world I was dead. You buried me, not in the ground, but in lies. You made my absence convenient and my memory profitable." Her face flushed crimson. She opened her mouth again, but no words came. I stood then, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. My hand rested on the briefcase, but my gaze fixed on Melissa. "You thought I would walk in here tonight and play the role you wrote for me, the prodigal father, forgiven and grateful. But I am not here to play your part. I am here to tell the truth." I pulled the banker's box from under the table and set it beside the briefcase. Its cardboard edges were worn from years of handling its label clear, 1999-2004. I opened it and pulled out a stack of letters bound with string. "These," I said, holding them high, "are the letters I wrote. Hundreds of them. Every birthday, every Christmas. Every milestone I could guess at from afar. They came back, unopened, stamped, returned to sender. You told people I was gone, but you knew. You saw these letters. Some of them were held for weeks before being returned. You hesitated. You chose. The guests stared at the envelopes, their stamps faded but still visible. Evidence of a father's persistence and a daughter's rejection. I looked around the table, letting my words reach every corner. You've raised glasses in my memory. You've nodded along to her speeches. You've believed a tragedy that never happened. Tonight, you know the truth. I am alive. I have always been alive. And my daughter buried me for her convenience. Melissa's voice cracked, then desperate. I had to. You don't understand. I needed to protect my family. Your life, your job. It didn't fit the world I was building. It was easier this way. Her confession hung in the air like smoke, ugly and undeniable. A few guests recoiled. One woman shook her head, muttering, "My God." I steadied myself, my chest tight, but my voice calm. Easier for you, Melissa. Never for me. Never for your mother who died without her daughter by her side. Never for your children who grew up believing their grandfather was a ghost. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the final piece, a check folded neatly made out to a scholarship fund for technical trades. The full inheritance, $6.4 million. I held it up for all to see. This is what my brother left me. Money Melissa thought might buy her way back into my life, but I will not let greed decide the value of family. Every penny will go to scholarships for young men and women who work with their hands, who build honest lives, who deserve to be honored rather than erased. Gasps filled the room again, softer this time, tinged with awe. I turned to Anna and Luke, their faces pale and wide-eyed. You are welcome to know me if you choose. But know this, I will never again be silent. I will never again play dead for anyone's convenience. With that, I closed the briefcase, the sound sharp and final like a gavel. The performance was over. When I walked out of Melissa's house that Christmas Eve, snow crunching under my boots, the night felt sharper, clearer. George walked beside me in silence, his jaw set tight, the cold air puffing white from his breath. Behind us, the lights of the Tudor home glowed warm against the darkness, but inside, I knew the warmth had cracked. The illusion Melissa had built for 25 years had been torn open in front of her friends, her husband, her children. The drive back to my small house was quiet. George didn't speak until we pulled into my driveway. You did what you had to, he said, simply before patting my shoulder and heading home. I stood for a long while on my porch, looking up at the night sky, snowflakes drifting lazily, and felt something I hadn't felt in decades, peace. The days that followed unfolded like a storm. By Christmas morning, whispers were already circulating. George told me later that the Hendersons had canceled a party they had planned at the country club, unwilling to be associated with Melissa so soon after her exposure. By New Year's, the Davises had followed. At first, it was just the social circle, but it spread quickly. Word moved through Shaker Heights like a contagion. The woman who buried her own father in lies. The daughter who built a reputation on grief she never had to live. I didn't have to imagine how it spread. People told me. Old co-workers from the factory called after reading about the scholarship donation in the Gazette. The article painted me not as a bitter man, but as one who had chosen dignity and generosity, a man giving $6.4 million to fund futures for young workers. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had been invisible for 25 years, yet now the city saw me clearer than ever. Jonathan, for his part, reacted swiftly. By mid-January, word reached me that he had filed for separation. Whether it was shame, betrayal, or simply fear of losing his own reputation, I'll never know. Melissa had not only lied about me, she had lied by extension to him, to their children, to everyone who had toasted her words. The foundation of their marriage, polished and pristine on the outside, had cracked. Melissa called me once 2 weeks after Christmas. I let it go to voicemail. Her voice was raw, stripped of the polish she had worn at the dinner table. "Dad," she began, her breath shaking. "You've destroyed everything. My marriage, my career, my standing. People won't look me in the eye. You've taken it too far. Please call me back." I never called back. For the first time in my life, I felt no guilt in the silence. I had given her 25 years of letters of chances, of olive branches. She had chosen lies every time. My silence now wasn't rejection, it was closure. But my grandchildren did call. Anna reached out first, timid and soft-spoken. Grandpa, she said when I answered the word strange on her tongue, but warming my chest instantly. I'm sorry for all of it. We didn't know. Luke called a few days later, his voice steadier but no less uncertain. They wanted to meet away from the mansion, away from the country club circle, away from their mother's shadow. We met at a small diner near downtown. They sat across from me in the cracked vinyl booth, hands wrapped around mugs of hot chocolate eyes, searching mine for the pieces of truth they had been denied. I told them about Margaret, their grandmother they never knew. I told them about the factory, about the red bicycle I'd worked overtime to buy for Melissa when she was their age. I told them about the scrapbook Margaret had kept every clipping of Melissa's achievements, pasted carefully with notes in the margins. I told them about the letters, about how many times I had tried. Anna cried quietly. Luke sat stiff fists clenched, jaw tight. They weren't tears of shame, they were tears of betrayal, not from me, but from the mother who had stolen their chance to know me. In the weeks that followed, they came by my house sometimes. We didn't talk about Melissa often, the wound was too fresh. Instead, we talked about their studies, their plans, their dreams. I showed them the scholarship paperwork, how the money would go to kids who wanted to learn trades, kids like me once who just needed a hand up. They seemed proud, maybe even inspired. Life settled into a new rhythm. My mornings were still simple coffee at the kitchen table, the Gazette folded beside me. But now, sometimes Anna would stop by after class, or Luke would call to ask about fixing his old car. Their presence was like sunlight breaking through a long winter. As for Melissa, I heard things secondhand. She stepped back from her law firm on leave, though most said she was pushed. Her name disappeared from the country club newsletter. The plaque with my name on it, the one etched in stone in their memorial garden, was quietly removed in February. They replaced it with nothing, the empty space more telling than any inscription. People ask me sometimes if I regretted it, if I regretted exposing her so publicly, shattering her carefully constructed world. My answer was always the same: no. For 25 years, I had been erased. For 25 years, people believed I was gone, and Melissa thrived on the sympathy of my absence. I had been made into a ghost. That night at her table, I became flesh again. I became truth. And truth, I've learned, is worth the cost. Now, when I sit at the kitchen table, Margaret's picture beside me, I feel her presence differently, not as sorrow, but as strength. She would have wanted our grandchildren to know the truth. She would have wanted me to stand tall, to remind the world that dignity is not embarrassment, that honest work is not shame. I still keep the letters, though. Now they rest not as burdens, but as proof. Proof that a father's love outlasts rejection. Proof that silence can be broken. Proof that even when the world believes you're gone, you can rise again. I am not the man Melissa buried in her obituary. I am Samuel Carter, machinist, husband, father, grandfather. I am alive, and I will never be forgotten again.